I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're listening to the only story that matters. This is true oral storytelling, written to be performed aloud and then recorded in one single, flawless take. SKALD's story is an ongoing one, but you shouldn't worry about what you've missed. Feel free to just dive in right here. And afterward, if you're interested in the backstory, you can always listen to previous episodes or even pick up the prose volumes on Amazon. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, part 43. They were sitting in the sand when they first heard the cries, when they heard the frantic yells, the excited shouts, the jubilant cheers. Caleria and Xylan were sitting shamefully in the sand. They had been ravenous from their march through the tundra, fed by rations that were far from sufficient. So in the heaps, those monstrous conglomerations of mud, of sticks, of leaves, and of dirt, when they offered the monk and the sorceress sustenance, albeit base, they had accepted eagerly. But when Maul had been sent on his way, when he had been pushed from the heap's village, pushed back out into the tundra, those condescending, arrogant masses of filth needed a new target for their scorn, somewhere new to direct their shame. And so they turned their sanctimonious gazes to Caleria and Xylan. Though the heaps had willingly offered them food and water mere moments before, suddenly, with no one else to shower with shame, their mood had changed. They towered over Caleria and Xylan, scowling down at them, remarking with disgust upon the speed at which they devoured the heap's food, their muddy water, and their hard crusts of bread. They pointed out how the two had contributed nothing to their village, how they had failed to even say thank you, and reiterated their disgust at the absolutely shameful speed at which Caleria and Xylan had set upon their meal. So the two sat in the sand, heads hung low, dejected, miserable, shamed. And as the heaps watched disapprovingly, they attempted to slow the speed at which they devoured those dry, miserable crusts of bread. And they were still sitting there, crestfallen, despondent, morose, when the heaps turned from them and began to cry out. "The Scion! He has returned!" Caleria and Xylan watched as the heaps began to dig wildly in the sand, hunched over, digging with both hands, throwing the sand back between their legs like so many massive, filthy dogs. "Scion, our boy, our son," they chanted, murmured, and cried out, so overwhelmed by their excitement, their anticipation, that only a few bothered to turn back and remark on the lack of effort being expended by their guests, who, though more than willing to share in their food, were loath to take part in their share of the village's work. The heaps dug, and they dug. They dug so deep that the sand turned dark and wet beneath their hands, so dark and so wet that it became indistinguishable from those thick, powerful, muddy fingers. When one of them caught a glimpse of the Scion, their son, their boy, their excitement, their digging, their efforts reached a fever pitch. They worked so hard, so diligently, so frantically that they were wholly unprepared for what came up out of the hole. Watching from their place in the sand, Caleria and Xylan didn't see much. Not at first. What they did see confused and frightened them, because whatever the heaps had dug up, whatever came up out of the hole, came up, swinging. The heaps closest to the hole, the ones that had already tired themselves out by their frantic, unorganized digging, fell first. The massive creatures let out terrible cries, shocked and horrified, far removed from the cries of excitement heard only a moment before. And then Caleria and Xylan watched in rapt terror as the monsters fell backward, collapsing on the thin, shifting sand with a crash, sleepy eyes open but glazed over, muddy heads stoved in where they should have been rounded, and cracked open where they should have been smooth. And as the heaps fell, as those monstrous piles of mud, of rocks, of sticks, of leaves, and of dirt, as they crashed down to the ground, a figure rose. A hulking, quivering ball of muscle, a grinning madman, a leering murderer, a warrior, a fighter, a killer, and a king clambered to his feet. With unhinged horror rising up in their throats, Caleria, Xylan, and the entire village of those muddy heaps gazed upon Maul, the one true king of men. When the heaps had taken him, he had been asleep. He had been unable to get to his weapon, to the notched, blackened, burnt, blood-stained cudgel that he wore by his side. He had been unable to fight, unable to defend himself. But he would not be taken unaware for a second time. As he pulled himself through the sand, as he heard the heaps and their excited cries, as he pushed the terrified, squirming boy forward to bait the monsters, as he pulled the child back by his skinny leg, kicking and screaming, Maul's hand had slid down to his waist, to the simple loop of leather on his belt, the one that held that broken branch of the world tree. His cudgel. He had loosed it. He had taken it in his hand. He had felt the heft as he began to force his way up through the sand, and he steeled himself for battle. Maul came up swinging, not with any kind of plan. No, he was far beyond that. He came up swinging with rage, bloodlust, and most terrifying of all, glee. Caleria and Xylan watched, transfixed by the display of pure violence, of utter carnage. They stared ahead, motionless from their spot in the sand, as Maul set about his grim, awful work, as he raised his cudgel above his head, as he clenched his eyes shut for a moment where time seemed to stand still, as he let out a war cry that had been passed down through his very blood, and began to do that at which he was best. The heaps closest to the hole had fallen almost immediately, felled by well-placed, brutal, punishing strikes from Maul's cudgel. Most crumpled limply to the ground, if not dead, then insensate, useless, posing no real threat. But that didn't stop Maul, because he wasn't out to simply win. You would cower in the sand. You would prostrate yourself in the dirt. Maul leapt upon the motionless heap closest to him and began to pummel the monster, grasping his cudgel with both hands, bringing it down again and again, on head, on body, on limbs, on whatever was left of that already dead creature. If that's what you want, then let me help you. Let me send you back to the earth from which you came. And as Caleria, Xylan, and the entire village watched in horror, Maul gleefully, joyously, ecstatically beat the monster into the ground. Maul drubbed the monster endlessly, allowing the village to fill with sickening thuds over and over again. He rained down blows upon the poor, departed creature until all that remained of it was a muddy mess, the life beaten out of it, then driven down into the sand. And when he was done, when Maul was finished with that particular act of brutality, he moved on to the next one. "You cowards!" Maul screamed as he straddled the next closest heap, the one that moaned weakly, its eyes growing wide as it saw the death that rushed down toward it. "You would shame me! You would command me! You would send me on your errands!" Maul's voice cracked and wavered with a potent, all-consuming rage. "I am a king!" Time stood still as they watched him, helpless to do anything as Maul went from felled monster to felled monster, repeating his task, returning the heaps to the dirt from which they came. But as Maul picked his way through the muddy carnage, finishing off the heaps that lay defenseless on the ground before him, one monster gathered what courage it could find and strode forward, crying out to the savage invader. "Stop! Stop it! You're killing them! How dare you!" In a single, fluid motion, Maul spun to face the hulking monster, the one that towered over him, and as he did so, he shot out his arm, swinging wide and high, catching the heap right in the jaw, smashing the back of his fist into the monster's face with a sickening crack. "How dare I? How dare I? I dare very well, you craven filth!" In his rage, Maul dropped his cudgel. Just beating these monsters wasn't enough. These awful, craven, hateful, sanctimonious, condescending beasts deserved so much more than that. So as the heap staggered, as it struggled to maintain consciousness, Maul dropped his cudgel. He kicked the monster in its knee. He watched it crumple down to the ground, and he seized it by its neck. "You stupid, arrogant fools!" Maul allowed a lunatic grin to creep across his face as he dug his fingers into the creature's muddy neck. "Your cowardice is bad enough. More than bad enough. But in addition to that, on top of that, you would try and give orders to me. You would impose your fear, your shame on one such as me." Maul was overcome with rage, with fury, with anger, and with hate. And as he let out another scream, a pained, agonized war cry, he squeezed the creature's head tight and pulled, ripping that ball of mud and sticks from its shoulders while its fellow villagers screamed in horror, terror, fear. and disgust. But Maul wasn't finished with the monster. Far from it. He wouldn't be satisfied until the monsters were not only dead, but returned to the earth that they so loved to grovel upon. So as the heaps panicked, unable to decide upon a course of action, unable to save themselves, unable to do anything, Maul picked his cudgel back up. He raised it in the air, and he brought it crashing down on the muddy monstrosities over and over again. As he did so, Caleria and Xylan could do nothing but watch. They cowered together in the sand, no better than the shameful heaps, and they watched in horror, in fear, as Maul, as that mud-splattered killer, went about his gruesome business. As Maul pummeled the creature, the one with the audacity, with the temerity to step forward and condemn him, some of the heaps began to speak up. Here and there, pockets of anger broke out as the heaps, tired of simply watching Maul beat the life from their brethren, rose up. "We can't let this continue," one cried out in a panic. "He'll murder us all." "But what else can we do? It's wrong to fight back. It's immoral." Another spoke, indistinguishable from the first, and equally panicked. "We'd be no better than him." Caleria and Xylan looked on in amazement as the creatures fought, as they bickered, as they argued, as the heaps not only refused to take action, but insisted upon shaming those who would even think of stepping forward, of doing something, of fighting Maul, of trying to save what was left of their village. And all the while, as they argued and fought with one another, Maul went from cowering heap to begging, pleading heap. He brought his cudgel down again and again, and over the bickering, over the arguing, over the pointless shouting, Caleria and Xylan could hear something else. Maul's laughter. Maul, panting heavily, chest heaving, stalked across the increasingly muddy earth. He set his gaze upon whatever monster was closest to him. He flashed that awful, sardonic, wicked grin, and he struck mercilessly, efficiently, tirelessly. He struck again and again. He beat the monsters into the earth. He laughed while he did it, and he moved on to the next. But eventually, it was too much. That unending, unchallenged slaughter was too much for even those cowardly heaps to bear. And so the monsters, the ones most outraged by Maul's actions, the ones least concerned with the outrage of their fellows, those who were offended at the mere notion of action being taken, they rose from the sand, and they lunged toward Maul. The savage had been unopposed in his rampage, but it had been hard work. It had been difficult, lifting that heavy club again and again, driving it down hard enough to smash the heavy earthen bodies of the creatures. Maul's body was glistening with sweat. Exhaustion was creeping up around the edges of his consciousness. But still, when the heaps finally mustered up enough courage to move on him, he was ready. Stealth and surprise, they would have aided the monsters. But that wasn't how they worked. No, Instead of sneaking up behind Maul, instead of seizing him and taking him as they had held him before sending him on their errand, they charged at him screaming, howling out their accusations and condemnations, hoping to lay him low with shame and guilt alone. As they should have already learned, shame meant nothing to one such as Maul, and the one true king of men had already taught himself to live with guilt. So, when the first heap came within range, Maul didn't shy away. He didn't prep himself for a parry or a dodge. No, he leaned in. He charged at his attacker. Caught the beast's artlessly swinging arm. He planted his foot on the monster's thigh, and he made unbroken eye contact with the heap so he could see its shocked, terrified face as he ripped its arm from its body. Using his momentum, Maul spun away from the howling monster, the one that stood frozen, staring at the spot where his arm used to be. Maul spun and released that heavy, earthen arm, sent it flying toward the next monster, the one smart enough to know that they must fight, but too stupid to realize that it was pointless, that the only reason they had ever held Maul was that he was sleeping when they found him, that he had been taken unaware. Now, Maul was in his element. Maul was taken with the frenzy of combat, with the ecstasy of the fight, and as long as he drew breath, he would not stop until the heaps and their entire village were driven into the ground. The heavy earthen arm struck the monster low, hit it in its kneecaps, tripping the clumsy, inelegant beast, sending it crashing to the muddy sand below. Maul ran and leapt toward the heap, jumping on its back as it struggled to right itself. He put his hands on the back of its head and he forced it back down to the earth, where he held it in place as he rained down blows upon it. He beat it again and again until he knelt not upon a twitching, dying body, but upon a sad puddle of mud, twigs, and leaves. Maul rose quickly, ready to take on whatever threat came next, ready to dismantle and destroy, ready to rend and rip apart whatever heap was nearest. When he scanned the area, when he sought out the monsters that had begun to move toward him, he saw something that summoned up a cruel, hateful, riotous laugh from deep within him. Those bold heaps, the ones willing to risk shame to defend themselves, they were already under attack by their brethren. Maul roared with laughter as he began to piece together what was going on. The heaps that had advised caution, that had demanded cowardice, that had decreed inaction, the law of the day, they could not simply stand by and watch as their fellows performed such forbidden acts of heinous immorality. No, they couldn't do that at all. So, sanctimoniously, they picked themselves up from the ground, and they too leapt into action, not to assist their brethren, not to save their village, not to work together and put down the murderer beating his way through their ranks. No, they would never do that, but instead they stood to turn against their fellow monsters. They heaped scorn and shame and guilt upon those willing to take action, and on some of the heaps, to Maul's delight, it actually worked. They regretted their anger. They repented their violent intentions, and they fell to the ground in shame, howling for forgiveness. Of course, with their heads already lowered, with their bodies already upon the ground, it only made Maul's purpose easier. As he prowled from heap to heap, smashing his club into their bodies in the midst of their contrition. But the remorse didn't take hold in all of the heaps. Some were too far gone. Some were too wise to think that anything good could come from capitulation to the violent madman that was dead set on reducing their numbers to nothing more than mud. Those heaps refused to be shamed, refused to be guilted into inaction, and so the monsters that would shame them, their outraged fellows, the ones that would shower them with guilt for their actions, they began to take actions of their own. The heaps who would attack Maul were set upon by heaps outraged by that violence, heaps that when pressed, heaps who when not heeded, whose outrage was not assuaged, would then lash out themselves, drawing the ire of yet more heaps, the ones who had managed to stay silent up until this point, but for whom the outrage came bubbling up from within, and then they were joined by others, the heaps outraged in all the outrage, the ones that thought, no, that they knew the real solution, who were then attacked by the heaps that, left alone upon the ground, had grown jealous, envious, because they too wanted to savor the taste of self-righteous outrage. It was bedlam. It was pandemonium. It was a violent, chaotic mess. And Maul loved it. When the monsters weren't screaming at one another, when they weren't spitting out arrogant, condescending venom, when they weren't bickering and arguing, they were tearing one another apart. They were beating one another to a pulp. They were doing Maul's work for him. Hilaria and Xylan huddled together in the mud, scrambling away from the violent outbursts that now surrounded them, taking cover behind what remained of one of the village's huts, watching fearfully as the heaps fought one another, as they screamed words of shame, of guilt, and of scorn at the top of their lungs, as they smashed into their huts, as they ground one another into the sand, and through it all, wielding his cudgel, meting out death after cruel death, stalked Maul, the one true king of men. Typically, Maul wasn't one to slow down in the midst of a battle. He was never one to take a rest, to take a breather, to let others do the heavy lifting for him when it came to combat. But this was something different, something special. Maul was delighted by the carnage that surrounded him, carnage that he had caused, destruction that he had no doubt brought to the Heaps village, and an annihilation that he had the freedom to simply watch as it played out. It was those shameful, fearsome, fearful, cowardly, now hypocritical monsters laid one another low as they beat each other into the dirt and tore their brethren to shreds. Maul simply walked amongst the casualties. He sought out what remained, not only the still breathing monsters, but any heap that resembled anything but a formless pile of dirt and mud. When he found something, when he found anything, he took his boots to it, stomping it down, grinding it into the earth, and if it was too difficult, if there was still too much substance there, he raised his cudgel, He let out that terrible, ear-piercing war cry, now more cackle than scream, and he brought it crashing down to the earth. Again, and again, and again. Eventually, Mole had to stop laughing. Not because he didn't think it was funny. No, he thought it was hysterical. He had to stop laughing because he was out of breath. Not from exertion. By that point, Mole hadn't done anything but watch for several moments. Hadn't done anything but watch and laugh as what remained of the heap shamed, battered, guilted, and destroyed what remained of one another. No, he was out of breath because he had been laughing so hard for so long. So he stood there, bent at the waist, hands on his knees, eyes clenched shut, tears running down his face, and he forced himself to stop laughing just long enough to fill his lungs with air. Once he had done so, he allowed himself a restrained chuckle as he marched over to the last surviving heap. The winner, the one who had lasted longest, who had successfully shamed his fellows, but had in the process been reduced to nothing more than a quivering, gurgling puddle of filth. Maul stood over what remained of the monster, flashing a wry smile as he spoke. Shame on you. And then he brought his cudgel down one last time in a wide arc that ended with a wet thud and a peal of laughter. When Maul turned, the dull light of the heavy full moon reflecting off his cruel eyes, he saw that the huts of the village had fallen, that the village's monstrous inhabitants had been eradicated, that they had been turned into a thin sheen of mud that lay upon the rocky earth of that blasted, broken tundra. And amidst it all, he saw the monk and his witch, Xylan and Caleria. They had stood up. They had risen from their knees, and they approached, shaking and confused. Xylan, still bestial, still monstrous, but unable to find his scavenger's laugh, was the first to speak. Maul, I don't know what happened. I do. Maul shot his companions a sneer of disgust. You two, you found creatures just as cowardly, just as craven as you are. You gave in. The sorceress, unable to deny Maul's account, still took offense. Hold your tongue, brute. It must have been some spell. Then why didn't you break it? Maul roared, and he stepped dangerously close to the sorceress. What's the point of having a witch if she can't defend against magic? Xylan, eager to defuse the situation, touched Maul as gently as his shaking paw could manage. Maul, please. Please, nothing. Maul brushed Xylan's hand off his shoulder, but kept scowling at Caleria. You're lucky, witch. Lucky that your monk is the only one who knows how to find SKALD. It's the only reason I didn't leave you both here to wallow in your shame. Maul turned and marched toward one of the wrecked huts. Get your potions, witch, and gather what food you can. We've lost enough time already. I won't lose any more on account of your spinelessness. As they dug through the rubble, searching for food, for water, for anything that could be of use on their journey, Maul began to hear a cry, a whimper, a pitiful mewl. And as he lifted up what remained of a hut's wall, he found that which he had been sent to retrieve. The heap's scion. The child, still human, uncorrupted by the morality of his people, sat shivering in the muck, eyes filled with tears and fear. You killed them. You killed them all. No. Maul looked at the scared, lonely little boy and forced his memories to the darkest, most inaccessible part of his shattered mind. They killed themselves. The child covered his face as heavy tears began to form on his long, delicate eyelashes. But why? Why did you even bring me here? It doesn't make any sense. You could have just left me. As the child spoke, Maul was joined by Caleria and Xylan, though they remained silent, unprepared to deal with the child, and unsure how to deal with him, even if they had been prepared. I brought you back because I had to, so your people would let me back in. The child didn't understand, so he looked up at Maul, pleading, begging him for help, for assistance, for anything, begging him with his wide, fearful eyes. But what do I do now? Maul snorted, turned, and walked away. Whatever you want. I hope you're digging SKALD, because I love doing it each and every week. Thing is, as a completely DIY project with no advertising or marketing budget, I need your help getting the word out. And the best way to do that? Reviews of the podcast on iTunes and Stitcher, and of the 2 prose volumes now available on Amazon. This week, I'm happy to read an excerpt from an amazing review that David Searcy left for Volume 1 on Amazon. King Maul is a difficult character to like. His best quality is probably that he's a jerk. People he meets seem to die quickly, and the next time he makes a lighthearted comment will be the first. Despite this, Aubrey Sitterson manages to make his quest one that is engaging, and that is a supremely difficult task. You may not like Maul, but that never impacts your enjoyment of his journey. Reviews are incredibly helpful, but in order for me to keep SKALD going, I need to be able to pay for things like podcast and web hosting, as well as a boring adult stuff like bills. To pitch in for this completely free weekly podcast, head to patreon.com/SKALD. Come find me and say hello on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram. Username Aubrey Sitterson. Or hit up AubreySitterson.com for links to everything, including SKALD, the upcoming Street Fighter G.I. Joe comic book, my wrestling talk show Straight Shoot, bio, contact information, and more. This week, I've got a comics recommendation for you. If you aren't buying it already, go pick up the all-new Nova series from Marvel. It's written by my old friend Sean Ryan, with awesome art by Corey Smith, and it features not one, but 2 Novas, which also happen to be father and son. It's already off to an amazing start, and I'm stoked to see where it goes next. Find it at your local comics shop, or check out the digital version on Comixology. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.